In the article, Graphic Representation of Force in Secondary Education, Analysis and Alternative Educational Proposals, the authors look at the issues students face while working with force diagrams. This is an example of a basic force diagram. In physics, a force diagram is how we show what forces are acting on an object. The object is usually represented by a box. In our case, it's this green box right here. And there's a vector, this black arrow, which represents a force acting on our object. In this example, the force acting on the box is labeled weight. It is the vectors which cause students issues, according to the article. A vector looks like an arrow, and arrows in students' daily life usually represents displacement or movement. But an arrow in our force diagram, or a vector, does not necessarily represent that the object is moving in that direction. The authors then go on to describe how human beings process images. For instance, if we take this force diagram, when we look at the screen, we aren't fully conscious in interpreting that force diagram. The first stage of interpreting images is unconscious, and it doesn't depend on our knowledge, rather it depends on universal rules. The authors explain that because weight is written below the object, it causes students and anyone who looks at this diagram to think unconsciously that weight belongs to the object, which can be confusing. But in actuality, weight is a force acting on the object due to gravity. Also, because students see arrows as direction, this representation seems to indicate to students that weight is moving down. But actually the arrow is indicating the direction of the force is downwards, but not that that weight is actually moving. So the authors propose an alternative for introducing students to forces. The alternative involves the use of a diagram which looks like this. This is called a symbolic representation of interactions, or SRI. The benefits to this view is that we have this double-headed arrow rather than a vector. So a vector, students mistake it as meaning direction. But we learn that weight is a body interacting with the earth because it's a force caused by gravity. And to a student, a double-headed arrow seems to indicate that the two objects are interacting. Another benefit is that this represents both the earth and the body. Thus, it shows students a more complete picture, whereas the force diagram just showed the body. The paper goes on to describe the author's research. They carried out 2 experiments. The first experiment used 15 and 16-year-old students. The students were given a document explaining Newton's third law. Some documents explained it with SRI diagrams, and other documents used force diagrams. The results indicated that students more easily understood the law when SRI diagrams were used. The second experiment was done on 24 students who were between the ages of 15 and 16 years old. They were given a document discussing gravitational, electromagnetic, and nuclear interactions. After the document was discussed with the students, they were asked to develop their own graphical representations of 2 objects interacting. 14 of the students used lines with double-headed arrows to represent 2 objects interacting. These images were drawn by students and demonstrate the double-headed arrow method. This image that was on the left is 2 sets of magnets, the top demonstrating attraction and the bottom demonstrating repulsion. This image, which was on the right, shows the interactions involved when a book is sitting on a table. The study was done in Spain, and so the students wrote in Spanish, but libro means book, mesa means table, and tierra means earth. And we can see that this diagram has double-headed arrows all throughout it. Only 6 students use single-headed arrows, or vectors, to represent the book sitting on the table. One example is this. The L with the arrow pointing down represents the weight of the book. The vector pointing up, labeled M, is the push from the table onto the book, and the downwards vector, labeled M, is the weight of the table. We can see that students did not show the force of the book pushing down on the table or the interactions between the book and the earth when they used vectors. But the students who used the double-headed arrows did show these interactions. In the first example, SRI seemed easier for students to understand. In the second example, some students created representations similar to SRI diagrams. And their diagrams that showed the book on the table were more comprehensive than the students who drew more traditional force diagrams. This indicates that perhaps teachers should introduce students to forces using SRI and then introduce vectors and force diagrams. This way, students will gain an overall view, a more complete view of the situation. Then, when they dive into the more specific view with force diagrams, they'll be less confused because they can relate them back to the SRI diagrams. The authors then go on to describe an interesting method for teaching students complex force problems, which they had been successfully using with students for 6 years when the paper was published in 2001. First, a problem is presented along with an image representing that problem. Students give their initial response to the questions posed. The instructor then takes students' responses and groups them together so that students can see how their answer relates to other students in the class. The instructor then facilitates a debate among the students. The instructor can interject throughout the debate. One interjection might be that they ask students to describe what objects and interactions are involved in the problem. The instructor can take the student responses to this and organize them into an SRI diagram. They can explain to the students what an SRI diagram is and how to make one. The students and the instructor will eventually reach a solution. The solution may be able to be demonstrated experimentally, and if it can be, it should be, so that students can further grasp the problem. I thought that this method of teaching forces was intriguing. Often we don't think about debating when we think about science. We expect that students should just accept what we show or tell them without asking them to use their prior knowledge to conceptualize the problems. I liked that this method allowed students to have a debate. Learning to have a debate is a valuable skill. It also encouraged them to dive into the problem with knowledge they may already have. This helps them to develop yet another valuable skill: problem solving. I also thought the use of SRI diagrams would help students when initially thinking about forces, because it makes the connection that forces are interactions, rather than the force diagram, which seems to imply to the student that an object is moving. I would definitely try the method the authors describe for problem solving and the use of SRI diagrams in my future classroom.